welcome to Commander Center, episode 310, and today we'll be taking a look at a listener, Dylan Gibson's Inalla Archmage Ritualist deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how's it going today, man?
Pretty good, Dana. How are you?
I am doing all right. And for everyone who's curious out there, Chris is doing pretty well too. He was not in the shop again this week, but we've got some status reports from him, and he's doing pretty good. So we might have him on the air possibly next week, but maybe even the week after, worst case. So yeah, looking forward to that.
Yeah.
And I got to go play at the shop this week, Max. You did not. You had stuff going on, but I went and played some games. The first thing I will note, and I don't think I told you this, our friend Dr. Mike built a new deck.
Oh, of course he did.
He built a Tulane deck.
Okay. I saw your tweet about your local friend built the Tulane deck, and I instantly thought to myself, this sounds like some Dr. Mike BS, so continue on about what this Tulane deck does.
So it only features cards that have a book or a library or something referencing a book or a library or a tome in the art or in the card name. So Sylvan Library would be okay, he has a Sylvan Library in there. Any card that has a librarian in the name, so Magus of the Library is in there. So everything has to reference a book or a library or something, including his lands. He found a couple of different basic lands that are close enough that, show either something that could pass for a library. So he doesn't even really have duels in it. He just has everything showing books or libraries. And, of course...
And let me guess, did it win?
Yeah, it won, because it's Tulane. It still won the game, because he just drew so many cards. Because that's just how Tulane works. But I thought that was funny that even with that restriction, he wins a game with his Tulane deck.
That's hilarious.
And I got to get a win, I think it was the game after that, with my Galissa deck, where I did have a Vidalcan Ori out, so I could do a few things at instant speed. And I had a Poison Tip Archer out, so whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses a life. And in order to, so the Kess player who was popping off was afraid that I was in a board wipe, and because he was relatively low on life, at like 8 or something, so he killed my Poison Tip Archer and then passed the turn to me. I was able to, before the end of his turn, flash in Isrith the Awakener, who's a black creature from M19. Whenever Isrith attacks, you can pay X, and if you do, return target creature card with CMC X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I was able to flash in Isrith. I just happened to have enough mana to do so. Came to my turn, attacked with Isrith, used 3 mana to bring, or 4 mana to bring back my Poison Tip Archer that was dead, and was then able to flash in a Plague Engineer, naming insects. Plague Engineer gives the creatures of the chosen type -1/-1, and there was an insect tribal deck on the table that had like 7 or 8 insects in play, which killed them all, which generated enough triggers to kill the Kess player, who on my Isrith attack had done something, I forget what it was, to draw 40-some cards. So I had to do that all with the 40 draw on the stack in order to survive and kill the Kess player.
Wow, that's a lot of brain power, I think.
It wasn't like I planned none of that. I just had I happen to have Isrith in hand. I happen to have Vidalcan Ori out. I happen to have the mana to free to cast so I could actually attack with it on my turn. I had the Plague Engineer. I just happened to be playing against a deck that had 1/1 tokens that I was able to kill to generate the triggers. It was just everything lined up, and it was one of those, like, I'm looking at my hand doing the math going, wait a minute, something's here. I can not die next turn. So, yeah, that was my interesting story, aside from the insane Tulane deck as well. So had some good games, had a good time.
Nice.
And have you messed around with your new deck at all? I know you got to play it the previous week, Max. Have you made any changes or anything to it yet?
No changes yet. I did some gold fishing with it the other morning, and then got emails hit my inbox, so I had to go back to work.
Sure, yes, that will happen. All right, well, it's pretty quiet in the world of Magic, I guess, right now. There's nothing really going on Commander-wise at all anyway. Lurrus got banned in every format, more or less, basically, where it was still legal. That doesn't really affect us. It wasn't a crazy expensive card, but I guess it'll be cheaper if you want a Lurrus for your Commander deck. You can get one now for a couple $, cheaper than it was, but that's really all that's happened in the last week. It's been a quiet week for Magic, so. Yeah,
and we got the new Capenna, start of new Capenna previews were last week.
That's true, yeah, they revealed the I guess they're not called Triomes, but the equivalent of Triomes for the other 5 that didn't exist, so those got previewed. I don't play, I have one 3-color deck, and that's the only thing that's beyond 2 colors, but I mean, I'll put it in my 3-color deck. I think the Triomes are good enough for sure, particularly being fetchable.
Yeah, I have 2 3-color decks. I run the Mardu one in Ishin.
Okay.
But I don't think I'm going to slot the Bant one into Tuvasa just because Tuvasa, that tempo hit is going to hurt.
Yeah, they can in some decks for sure.
So it's definitely a card I don't want to see in my opening hand unless I have the other 2 colors to back it up. I guess I could take a turn 1 off. And also cycling it for 3 mana is a lot in that deck versus,
Right, yeah.
The bicycle lands from Amonkhet are only 2, so I probably won't run the Triome in Tuvasa.
Yeah, people were pumped for it. I feel like 4 and 5 color decks don't need even more good lands, but whatever. I think that ship has sailed, so I'm not sure if it makes that much difference. And really, no one's running 10 of them in a 5 color deck anyway, so I just don't think it changes that much, really.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think most people would prefer the Shocks over the Triomes, but I mean, if you're cracking packs at your LGS and you open all 5 of them, there you go.
Well, that's an easy thing to forget, because they are, when lands get to $5 or $6, people are like, oh, that's a lot for putting in my deck, but sometimes you're just someone who plays a lot of F&M or just cracks a lot of packs, and if you happen to be opening that set, you just have a lot of those things. You and I still probably have a lot of fetch lands from way back in Tarkir block, because we played a lot of Magic and opened a lot of packs, whether it was, I think we both bought a box of Khans of Tarkir, and then just picking up packs here or there, doing F&Ms, doing different things like that. We just picked up fetch lands. So I still have surplus fetch lands I haven't used from picking them up way back then. And I think that's a thing that, so it looks like, when I go build a new deck, I'm like, oh, it's $25 for a fetch. It looks expensive. It was just something I got from an F&M draft that I kept afterwards, or from a pre-release or something. And that's how this kind of thing works too. In a couple of years, people will just have Triomes lying around. They'll just have the lands from the Innistrad set last time that are really good in EDH lying around. So yeah, I mean, the price, particularly if you're getting things that way, isn't quite that big of a deal.
Right. And the only other big thing we saw from that was the Ascendancies are coming back.
Yeah.
We got to see the Bant one of that. And then we got to see the new skyscraper art style. That was pretty cool. I like that art style, but
for sure,
that's all we really got.
Yeah, and again, we said this before, and I'll say it again. I do like the alt art stuff they keep putting in these sets, because it keeps the prices down. If you're not somebody who cares about anything fancy, it does knock some dollars off of you just trying to get the base versions of those cards.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, I have a foil deck or 2 that I try to put the premium version in. So when guys like me pay a little bit more for that special alt art version that we get, that kind of drives the price down of the base version a little bit. I think it's kind of good for everybody. All right. Should we just jump into this deck tech here, Max?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Dylan Gibson has sent us his Inalla Archmage Ritualist deck. And we have a link here we will post when we put the tweet out for the show. The meta I play in is mostly the Commander Central Slack group, and the goal of the deck is to get out an effect like Arcane Adaptation so I can clone my big splashy creatures.
He's found that with all the setup it takes to get the effects out, small value pieces aren't enough, so I focus on big effects like Gyruda and Arcana Cruelty. Some weaknesses are that the deck is pretty clunky and takes a lot of mana to get set up. The tutor package could use some improvement, and any new splashy ETB effects are always welcome. His final notes are that Chromatic Orrery is a pet card of his, so he would ask us not to cut it. And his budget limit is about $30 per 1 card.
All right, very cool. And I totally get the pet card thing. I, at this point, have 1 or 2 in almost all of my decks that whenever I go to make a change, I'm like, man, that's probably the worst card in the deck, but I don't care. I want to have a couple of those fun things in there. So, yeah, completely get that. So, for those that don't recall, Inalla Archmage Ritualist is 2 and Grixis, 5 mana total for a human wizard. Inalla is a 4/5 and has Eminence. Whenever another non-token wizard enters the battlefield under your control, if Inalla is in the command zone or on the battlefield, you may pay 1, and if you do, create a token that's a copy of that wizard. The token gains haste, and then you exile it at the beginning of the next end step. You can also tap 5 untapped wizards you control, and target player loses 7 life. I'm sure that happens on occasion, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone with an Inalla deck actually do that. They're just focused on copying wizards and making value. So the first thing here we will take a look at is the land base. There's 37 lands in the deck, which is roughly what I tend to start with for a 3-color deck. We have a Bojuka Bog, a Command Tower, a crumbling Necropolis, taps for all 3 of the colors relevant here, but it does come into play tapped. Probably still not a big deal. since it perfectly fixes you. Exotic Orchard, 1 mana of any color of a land that an opponent controls. In a 3-color deck, you're probably going to get 2 of the colors you need, if not all 3. There's 10 islands, there's 9 mountains, there's 9 swamps. There's your Reliquary Tower, there's your Riptide Laboratory, taps for colorless, or you can spend 1 and a blue to return target wizard you control to its owner's hand. So lets you bounce a wizard to replay it and make another token of it. Sunken Hollow, which is the black-blue island swamp. Unclaimed Territory, when it ETBs, you choose a creature type, and you can add 1 mana of any color if you're using it to cast a spell of the chosen type. In this case, it will be for wizards, and you can tap it for a colorless mana as well. Last but not least, Urza's Saga. Everyone knows what that does because it's a crazy card, and maybe it's on theme because Urza is a wizard as well. So, land, Sweet Max. What do you think here? What would you add or remove? What do you like or dislike?
I like the 37 number for this high-costed commander. 5 CMC is a lot. 37 is a good number, I think, for 3 colors, especially not in green. The main thing I would like to see kind of switched up here is just maybe put in some more duels. There are quite a few out there now that are cheap to get, like money-wise. Like all the Crimson Vow and Midnight Hunt duels are all around under $10. So there's Storm-Carved Coast, Haunted Ridge, and Shipwreck Marsh. You could add the Battle Bond and Commander Legend Arena lands, but note that the Morphic Pool and Luxury Suite are pushing 30, so that's kind of at the high end of the budget. But Training Center, which was in Commander Legends, is like $7. And then, we were just talking about Shocklands in conversation about those Triomes. All 3 shocks for this deck are about $15. I think 1 is $17, but the rest are under $15, so it kind of averages out there. I think just adding those duels would probably smooth this mana base out just a little bit better and maybe gets your deck online quicker since you have access to more colors faster.
Yeah, I agree with that. Pricing is in the $20-ish range for both of these lands, City of Brass and Mana Confluence, which will make you any color as well. The damage they deal to you just doesn't really matter very much.
Right.
But again, the price isn't great. If you have a Mana Confluence, because you maybe were playing back in Theros, I would put it in. If, it gets reprinted in Commander Legends or something and the price drops down to $10 or $12 or something, I would grab one before it goes back up. I don't think you necessarily need them. There's enough other slightly budget lands you can run, but I do think in a 3-color deck you can almost always afford to lose the life off Confluence and City of Brass, and the perfect fixing makes them worthwhile. I would absolutely, long term, if you get a chance and you love the deck, get both of them in there. But they're both also subject to a random reprint, and they're the kind of lands that get halved in price before they slowly trickle back up until the next reprint. So they're the kind of thing you can just wait on too and see if they get one and then snap one of each and be happy when they double in price over the course of the next year. Those were the one weird one I would suggest that I kind of like. I'm a fan of the card Port of Carafel. It's one of the uncommon lands from Kaldheim. It does ETB tapped, but it taps for blue mana, so that's kind of nice. And you can spend 3 blue, black, and sacrifice it to mill 4 cards and return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It's not the kind of thing that you're using all the time, but it's the kind of card that, like, I find I'll drop it on turn 1 when nothing else is going to happen because I don't have a Soul Ring in hand, or I'll drop it on turn 8 when I can probably afford to not, worry too much about losing that 1 mana for it coming to play tap, and then find myself 3 or 4 turns later or something when I need some extra gas, just crack it to bring a creature back from our graveyard to play. In this case, then maybe copy it. So I do think it's for the 13 cents or whatever it is it costs. It's got a lot of utility in decks that have a good amount of value creatures. I would consider that one as well.
Sounds good.
All right, Max, what should we talk about next?
Why don't we move over to the artifacts?
All right.
There are 19 of them. So we have Arcane Signet, Chromatic Orrery, Commander's Sphere, Conjurer's Closet, Dimir Signet, Everflowing Chalice, Felwar Stone, Izzet Signet, Maskwood Nexus, Rakdos Signet, Replicating Ring, Skyclave Relic, Soul Ring, Sundial of the Infinite, Sword of Hearth and Home, Talisman of Indulgence, Thran Dynamo, Wayfarer's Bauble, and Wishclaw Talisman.
So you have a note here in our notes here, Max, about what you think about the Mana Rock Suite.
I do. So based on the current deck list how it is, I think there are too many Mana Rocks. There are currently 13, and that's counting the Chromatic Orrery, which we're not cutting. This is kind of what I found in my Ishin deck, specifically my new 3-color deck. I also run, I originally ran a lot of artifacts, a lot of Mana Rocks. I think I had all 3 Talismans, Arcane Signet, Soul Ring, Commander, Chromatic Lantern, and a few others. I think I was pushing about 10 10 rocks. And what I found is that I have a lot of draw in that deck. I could use a little more, but most of the time I was just drawing rocks, which is fine, but they don't do anything outside of helping you cast other things. So what I found is late game, when I'm drawing 3 or 4 cards, off of a spell, drawing and 2 of those being a mana rock, that's not what I want to see late game. I want to see them early game or not at all. So, and I think that's what this deck might also have a problem with is, turn 8, you go and draw 3 or 4 cards, and you're finally drawing your signets or your talisman. And that's not kind of the game-winning move you kind of want to be playing on turn 8 or turn 9. You want that early game.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds counterintuitive a little bit, that you want less ramp. But I think what happens, I've noticed in decks that have, that are running this many mana rocks, you need to have an equal amount of card draw, or you find yourself in that position where you can make 16 mana on your turn, and you have 6 mana worth of cards in your hand. And I guess there's worse problems to have, but that is going to burn you too if you're being that inefficient. So I think 13 is a lot. I think you could very easily drop down to 10 and it would still be a lot. But I think 13, for how this deck is built right now in terms of how much card draw it has, it's mana that you're not going to be able to use. If you want to keep that money rocks, you need to have a lot more card draw, I think. And I don't think this is the style of deck that needs 13 anyway. Even if you do constantly have a full grip that you're able to utilize that many rocks, I think even dropping down to like 9 is going to be a lot of mana rocks in this style deck, and that's going to open up a bunch of slots to put more card draw in. So yeah, as counterintuitive as it might sound to say you're running too much ramp, in this kind of deck I just think you might be.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So personally, I would swap out the signets and put the other 2 talismans in. You already have the most expensive cost-wise one in the deck, and that's the red-black one. The other 2 are, sub $5. And I just have found that the talismans, not needing to put a mana into them to get 2 colored mana, comes in handy.
Sure.
So that's my thought on the talismans versus signets. I just like having access to that colored mana for the 1 life over having to figure out how to tap your mana to make sure you put the correct one into the signet to get the colors you need, and it gets complicated. I would also think I would probably cut like Replicating Ring. It's a cool card. Yeah, you get the cool game moment of making more of them if you get all the counters on it. So this is the one that at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a counter on it. Then if there are 8 or more, remove them all and create 8 copies of Replicating Ring that only tap for any color of mana. They don't have to add a counter to them. There's not anything in this that helps proliferate those counters, so It's a cool, I did it achievement, but I think it's something that you're not going to do very often.
I would tend to agree. It's tough to do that without cheating somehow, basically.
Yeah.
And this deck doesn't really have ways to do that.
Right. And my final idea for a cut, and I feel like you're going to disagree with me on this, is Everflowing Chalice.
If you have to cut, I do think there's plenty of mana rocks here, so you can easily, that would be one that I wouldn't be, because it makes colorless mana.
Right.
I wouldn't be against cutting that one for sure.
Yeah.
One swap, I guess, I would make here. I talked about not having enough draw. Midnight Clock is just a really, really good card. I just never regret seeing it, and not only do I never regret seeing it because it's going to draw me 7 cards in a couple turns, I love it when someone complains and goes, "Oh, I got to remove it. I got to remove it," and they have to blow one of their removal spells. I mean, Midnight Clock. That's just as good. Having somebody waste a removal spell on your 3 mana rock is fantastic also. That you come out ahead. Then they're not hitting something that's game changing, although drawing 7 cards can be game changing too. I just think it's a super good card. This deck, it doesn't seem like it goes crazy fast. I would 100% put that in the place of something, whether it's Skyclave Relic or Replicating Ring or whatever. Just put it in. It's just the amount of gas it can provide is crazy. It's just such a good card.
I've actually never seen anybody remove that card off your board state, so my jaw kind of dropped there when you said someone did
it this week. I got hit with a Chaos Warp and they were annoyed by it. They're having to do it. and then like 2 turns later, there was like 3 worse things on the board, and they're like, I should have just left it alone.
Yep.
So, yeah, that was one I would definitely look at for sure there. Sundial of the Infinite is also one thing we will note here that's in the deck, kind of a strange card. That's going to stop those tokens from going away, stop them from being sacrificed at the end of the turn. So that's just a way to save those if anyone was wondering what purpose that was serving here. That's what it is.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a look at the enchantments then. There are 7 enchantments here. We have Arcane Adaptation. When it ETBs, you choose a creature type, and creatures you control are the chosen type in addition to other creatures. Conspiracy is a black version of more or less the same thing. When it comes into play, choose a creature type, and creatures you own become that type. Similarly, you have Xenograft. When it ETBs, choose a creature type, and each creature you control is that type in addition to other types. So basically, this is a way of making everything, even non-wizards in this deck, into a wizard. There's some draw spells here as well. There's Phyrexian Arena, which everyone probably knows. Same with Rhystic Study. There's Psychic Possession, which is a card I'm a big fan of. Whenever an enchanted opponent draws a card, you draw a card, so you put it on somebody who's probably going to be drawing a lot. And last but not least, there's Molten Echoes. So when it ETBs, you choose a creature type, and whenever a non-token creature of the chosen type comes into play under your control, you create a token that's a copy of that, and that token gains haste, and you can exile it at the beginning of the next end step. So we have a way to do another Inalla ability and a bunch of things that make your creatures into wizards and some card draw. So those are basically the 3 things we have going on here. Max, any enchantments that you think would shine in this deck or that you don't like among the ones we have?
There's nothing I don't like. Okay, I like all of these, but I have an issue, and we'll talk more about it in the creature section, I think, / the sorcery section about what I think about this deck kind of overall. But I think there are definitely some that could be added. The first being Kindred Discovery. This was from that same commander set that Inalla came from. You enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type, and whenever a creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield or attacks, you draw a card. So that means that token Inalla makes, you draw a card. When you attack with them, you draw cards. This card is a house in a tribal deck.
Card's crazy.
And it's like $22 to $24, so it's not terribly expensive, but this would probably be in the top 3 of, if you're going to add any 3 cards to this deck to spend the money on, get this one.
I have one more Molten Echoes-esque card here that I would suggest that might work is Flame Shadow Conjuring. It's 3 and a red from way back in Origins. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay a red. And if you do put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that creature, that token gains haste, exile at the beginning of the next end step. So it's just another version of the Inalla effect, basically. On an enchantment, it just gives you one more way to trigger that. And similar to Inalla, you can use your Sundial to kill the trigger and keep the token around if you want to, or if you happen to have sack outlets or whatever, it's a way to utilize those as well. But it's just one more way to get that extra trigger off those things ETBing. But yeah, other than I think those couple of suggestions, because it's such a clean grouping of 3 things. You have draw, you have things that change your creatures, and you have, in the case of Molten Echo, something that makes you more copies. So like I think I like all of those enchantments for sure. What do we have for instants here, Max?
We have 6 instants: Arcane Denial, Chaos Warp, Illusionist, Stratagem. So this is 3 and a blue. You can exile up to 2 target creatures you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control, and you draw a card. First time I've ever seen this card, so that's pretty cool. I liked that one. Negate, Pongify, and Stinging Study. This is for 4 and a black. Draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the mana value of a commander you own on the battlefield or in the command zone. So 5 mana, 5 cards. That seems great.
Yeah, Chaos Warp will hit anything, solves basically any problem you have, and in colors that don't have ways to deal with enchantments, for sure. I think Chaos Warp is worth running in almost any deck, but particularly ones that have no baked-in way to deal with enchantments.
100% agree there.
There's 2 counter spells here, Negate and Arcane Denial. I like the fact that those are the 2 you're running because single blue pip in a 3-color deck makes it way easier to hit and use your counter spells. 2 is an odd number, but like, maybe it's not. For me, I always feel like I want a few more counters than that. I feel like 2 isn't enough. But there's no reason to think that. It's just as useful to stop 2 spells as it is to have the ability to stop 4. It's just a weird thing in my brain. I think if I want to have counter spells in a deck, I want to have more than 2, but that doesn't mean it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of in that same boat. I would like to see 1 or 2 more. I don't think we need to add 5 more, but a couple more would be nice. But the fact that it is 3 colors, it's hard to find the ones that have that single pip. You know, you could run something like Pact of Negation. I think that's like $15 nowadays. Sure. But you got to make sure you have the mana on your upkeep, you know, if you do cast it. Yeah, it's like $12, so that's not bad. That would probably be the one I would recommend to add, just because it's cheap money-wise, and it is free to cast.
Yeah.
So,
Stinging Study I like a lot. In this case, it's going to be 5 mana, draw 5. That's pretty solid most of the time. So yeah, I like that too. Pongify is a great piece of removal, even though it's blue and you're playing black. blue still might have the best creature removal in EDH at least. I mean, you could add a Rapid Hybridization here, or a Reality Shift here, or a Baleful Mastery here, and those would all be great too. There's just only so many slots, and I don't think any of those are better than what's here currently. Stratagem being able to, for 4 mana replace itself and generate 2 triggers is pretty good. I like that card.
Yeah.
In this deck especially, where everything has an ETB, so that one's real solid.
For sure.
11 sorceries in this deck. Beseech the Queen as a tutor. Blasphemous Act as a board wipe, along with Chain Reaction. I'll read Chain Reaction quick. It's 2 and 2 red. Chain Reaction deals X damage to each creature, where X is number of creatures on the battlefield, which means it winds up being a board wipe. Very infrequently is it ever like, are you casting it into 2 or 3 creatures? It's almost always, everyone has 1 or 2 things out and just it's doing 8 damage or 9 damage, which is enough to wipe the board. So that's just a good, efficient board wipe if you don't want to spend money on damnation, basically. Crux of Fate, similar thing. Destroy all dragons or all non-dragon creatures. Yeah, it's just a way to... It's gonna, in this deck where you have no dragons, really, it's just going to be... It's a budget version of damnation, basically. There's Diabolic Tutor here, another tutor. Mastermind's Acquisition, basically another version of Diabolic Tutor. A couple draw spells, Night's Whisper and Painful Truths. Painful Truths in this deck could conceivably draw you 3 because you have access to 3 different colors of mana, so draw 3 for 3 is pretty solid. Razaketh's Right is another tutor, essentially. Scheming Symmetry, you and someone else can go tutor something. And Sign in Blood, way to draw a couple more cards. So tutors to go get the pieces you need to make all of your stuff into wizards consistently and draw spells. That's really what's here under the sorceries. So he talked about wanting more tutors, but there's really not much you can add here without things getting expensive, basically.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing. Adding more tutors without breaking the bank is going to be really tough. And the tutors you could add are just tutors for probably other tutors. Like you could put a Merchant Scroll in here, or,
sure,
an Imperial Seal. That's a really bad example. I'm sorry, folks. Or like a Grim Tutor. Let's go with Grim Tutor. Like Grim Tutor's fine, but you're losing 3 life for a tutor where you're probably running... maybe not the most efficient stuff, but you're not losing life. Right. And this deck does not have a lot of lifelink in it, so I think it's definitely something to keep in mind that the few tutors that are affordable money-wise come with some big downfalls.
Exactly. The one I would maybe consider if you wanted one more is Dark Petition from back in Origins, actually, where Flame Shadow Conjuring was from. It's around $4-ish or so right now, and it's an unconditional tutor. Search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and it's for 5 mana, but it has Spell Mastery. If there are 2 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, you add 3 black to your mana pool. So in this deck where there's 6 instant 11 sorceries, you're not going to hit it every time, but I would guess often enough you're going to be able to basically make it into a demonic tutor. And in some cases, a better demonic tutor, because some cases getting trip black back actually fixes your colors. You're spending 2 black to cast it, and maybe you need the black mana to cast that Conspiracy. That's going to give you the mana, in case you don't have perfect fixing to get there too. So I actually think Dark Petition is a really solid tutor that I think doesn't see enough play. And if you really want to add a couple more, that would be the first one I would look at least among the budget ones, if you don't want to, get into demonic or vamp territory.
Yeah, totally agree. So there are a lot of tutors, which makes sense for what this deck is trying to do.
Yeah.
It's trying to find these key pieces that turn all the creatures into wizards so Inalla can do Inalla things. And Dylan, please let us know, does that make for, repetitive gameplay? Like, when you play this deck, does it just kind of play the same way every time?
So I can try to answer for Dylan, and I'm gonna maybe assume the same thing applies. I had various times, we mentioned this last week, talking about my Dragonborn Silumgar deck. One of the versions of that deck I tried was a go-wide kind of tokens deck with, fairies and different attacking bats and whatever, that I could turn into dragons, using all of these same cards. And I don't think I did not run this many tutors. I think I had 2 or 3 in my deck that I almost exclusively used to get one of those cards. And I had one additional unnatural selection that doesn't really work in this deck. So I guess I had access to 1 more than this deck does. You need to have those things, at least the way I was building it. You needed to have one of those things in play for the deck to kind of function. I think that's kind of the case here. Just so few of those creatures are wizards that you really need to be able to get one of those things. So my guess is that it doesn't make it redundant, because your focus is so much on getting one of those pieces to make your stuff into wizards into play. And then if someone removes it, getting another one. So I'm going to guess no. There also aren't any real silver bullet cards in here that you're going to go get with them in terms of like what's the absolute best thing to go grab. It's just going to be what. So like let's say you start the game with a Xenograph in hand and a Massive Nexus in hand and a tutor. You're like, well, I don't need to go tutor up a third one. I've got 2, I'm fine. What do you get then? We can get anything. You can go get a Phyrexian Arena so you have some draw, or a Ristic Study, or you can go get a counter spell so you can protect your stuff, or you can go get Kokosho so you have a great, ridiculous creature to copy, all of which are probably relevant targets. So my guess is because of number 1, the fact that you have a primary thing you want to go grab, number 2, because there's no like winning the game kind of targets necessarily, and number 3, just because how the deck plays, I would guess it doesn't get repetitive.
Okay.
But that's a guess. I'm curious to hear back from Dylan with that as well.
Yeah. I like I said, the reason I ask is I feel like it'd be one of those things like, cool, turn 4, go tutor for one of these pieces, play it.
Sure.
Turn 5, cast Inalla. Turn 6, start doing Inalla things. Which piece you grab, I don't know. Right. But, that's where the variance is. And yeah, you make a great point. There's no silver bullet for them to go grab and be like, hey, game over. So I get it. I mean, it's a cool thing to do. Yeah. I like doing unique things with, not doing what's on the beaten path.
And at least for me, what I found where tutors tend to cause repetitive play, which I guess maybe that isn't a bad thing for some people either. Maybe some people like their games to, look the same way. That's perfectly fine. For me, the problem was the silver bullet cards. It was grabbing Rider Replication in my Vela deck, knowing that if I kicked it, I dealt 26 damage or something to every single person. So that became the primary target. Or in my Glissa deck, when I had Torment to Hailfire in it, that was the obvious target, because even if it's turn 5, Torment for 3 or 4 screws everybody. And if it's turn 11, it probably wins the game. So that was just always the obvious target. So I found that I don't run many tutors in general anyway anymore, but the lack of silver bullet cards is, I think, what keeps them from being repetitive. If there isn't that obvious, just back-breaking card every single time, it's less of a problem, I think.
Okay, awesome.
Last but not least here, we have all of the creatures in this deck, because there aren't any planeswalkers, so there's 19 different creatures. And we have an Apprentice Necromancer. This one is a wizard, and you can sacrifice it, tap it, sacrifice it, and return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, and then sack at the beginning of the next end step. So it's a wizard that can recur your other things from your graveyard already. Arcana Cruelty, when it ETBs or attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or a planeswalker, discards a card and loses 3 life, and then you draw a card and gain 3 life. So that's 8 mana. Not a wizard. This is a good one, though. If you make it into a wizard with Conspiracy or whatever, feels pretty good to copy that effect, I would guess. And that's what we're going to look at here. There's a lot of bombs that aren't wizards that you want to make into wizards to copy, and there's good utility creatures. Like the next on the list, Bloodline Necromancer. It's a wizard with a lifelink for 3/2, and on ETBs, you may return a vampire or wizard creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So another way to recur and reuse those ETB triggers. Grave Titan, great thing to have a copy of out. Same with Grey Merchant of Asphodel, also not a wizard, but if you can make it one, then that's a lot of damage. Gyruda, Doom of Depths. It is not set as a companion in this deck, When it ETBs, each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, and you put a creature card with an even CMC from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. So, pretty solid thing to copy. Period Recruiter is a tutor to go get a creature with power 2 or less, so that's one we're looking to copy here. Also not a wizard. Same with Inferno Titan. When it comes into play or attacks, it deals 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 creatures or players. Kokosho, which we mentioned, when it dies, each opponent loses 5 life and you gain 5 life. You gain life for the life lost this way, so very often you're just gaining 15. Lord of the Void, when it deals combat damage to a player, you exile the top 7 cards of that player's library, and you can put a creature from among them on the battlefield under your control. That's a good thing to copy as well. Massacre Girl, kind of a board wipe on a stick. Massacre Worm, similar, and it's also attached to a 6/5 body. That card is brutal. Mull Drifter is just a draw effect on a creature. Pretty useful to copy here, even especially if you can make it into a wizard. Naban, Dean of Iteration. If a wizard comes into play to your control, causing a triggered ability of a permanent to trigger, that ability triggers twice. So you're just doubling up on your wizard ETBs with Naban. Obeka, Brute Chronologist. The player whose turn it is may end the turn. I would guess this is primarily being used to keep the tokens that you're making with Inalla. Solemn Simulacrum, just a good ETB effect here that's going to get you a basic land card and presumably be able to copy that. Stony Brook Banneret. Merfolk spells and wizard spells that you play cost 1 less to play. 1 less to cast. So it's going to be functionally just a cost reducer on all of the wizards that you're going to cast. Tribute Mage, another tutor. To search your library for an artifact like Totem Bandit costs 2, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Last but not least, Watcher for Tomorrow. It's a wizard with Hideaway. So when it ETBs, it comes into play tapped, and when it does, look at the top 4 cards of your library, and you can exile one of them face down. And when Watcher for Tomorrow leaves the battlefield, put the exiled card into its owner's hand. So we're looking at like really big, good value creatures that you want to copy by turning them into wizards, or you have wizards that you can just always cast for value off of Inalla.
Right.
Anything you like here, Max, or don't like?
I am torn. Cue the 90s one-hit wonder.
Natalie Imbruglia.
Yes. I think this deck needs more wizards. There's only 8 of the 19 creatures are wizards. I'm not saying replace all these awesome things you want to turn into wizards with wizards, because let's face it, there are not a lot of big 6/5 wizards in the game that do something cool on ETB. But, we talked earlier about removing some of these mana rocks, or, removing those rocks. If you cut out 5 rocks, that's 5 more spots for a draw spell or creatures. And the reason I'm suggesting this is because what happens if you don't get any of the things that turn your creatures into wizards out? Then you're just, casting a Lord of the Void, and it's not a wizard. You don't get 2 of them. You're casting, an Inferno Titan that's not a wizard. So I think when you think about this deck probably likes to win after turn 10. You need stuff to do outside of playing mana rocks turns 1 through 3, 1 through 5. So there are plenty of wizards that are mana value inexpensive, cost-wise inexpensive, that do some really cool stuff that I would like to see in this deck. So there's stuff like Sage of Fables. That just says all your wizards enter with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. That's going to be great in this deck. Once you turn everything into a wizard, everything gets a counter. There is Direfleet Ravager. It enters the battlefield. Everybody's life total gets cut down by a third, and it has Menace and Death Touch, and I think it's like a 5/5. Antheomancer. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to target player equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. If you make 2 of those, I've played with a lot of people in our Slack. Not all of them are running just basics. So, that's going to do damage a lot of the time.
Like I said, in 2 copies of it could easily kill somebody.
And it has Unearth. So you can bring it back and make a copy of it.
That's a really good pick here. I like that one a lot.
Venzer Shaper Savant is a wizard. When he enters the battlefield, you can bounce stuff or return a spell off the stack. Those would be some of my bigger picks. What about you, Dana? Do you have anything you'd like to add or remove?
The first one that jumped out at me, because I knew it was a wizard, but it's in your list as Disciple of Bolas. Because it's a wizard, it can come into play. You can, after you've already used your Gyruda trigger up or something, sacrifice Gyruda, draw a handful of cards with the Disciple, and then use a couple of your things to replay, because there's a couple ways to get things back from your graveyard. Use a couple of those to bring, your Gyruda back or your Kokosho back or whatever it is. So that's one. You also have things like Kokosho, speaking of, that you need the death trigger. That's one more way to generate that if you need to.
Yep.
So that was the one that jumped out at me as wizards. But I do think that's a good point. I do think... I don't know if you need to add more wizards necessarily, because I understand what he's trying to do. That's just maybe the weakness of the deck, is you're going to get burned sometimes when you have no wizards out. You can't get to that Xenograft, so as a result, your commander's doing nothing. But I would say maybe it's not quite that bad here, because every one of those creatures still does a good thing.
Yep.
It'd be much preferable to get 2 Great Merchant triggers, but 1 Great Merchant trigger is pretty solid.
Yeah. I have a couple more I would like to recommend because they actually benefit wanting to do what it does. The first being Basalt Ravager. This was from Call Time. It's an uncommon for 3 and a red. When it enters it is a giant wizard. So right there, it covers the wizard checkbox. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that share a creature type.
Oh, yeah.
So even if that's your only creature you're casting this turn with Inalla out, you're still dealing, 3 times 2 is 6?
Yeah.
6 damage to 2 different targets, the same target. And then my final one is from Modern Horizons 2. It's Harmonic Prodigy. It's 1 in a red for a human wizard. It has prowess. That might matter, probably won't. But the important part is if an ability of a shaman or another wizard you control triggers, trigger that ability again. So now you're getting 2 Inalla triggers. Now you're getting 2 Basalt Ravager triggers. Now you're getting 2 Inferno Titan, double Inferno Titan triggers, double everything. It's just more triggers, which might help this deck kind of close out games, depending on what you're triggering, you're copying. I just said trigger a lot.
I mean, there's a lot of triggers, particularly if you have a Harmonic Prodigy out. Yeah, I think those are the main ones I had kind of looked at when I was putting my notes together too, Max. Because a couple of those are kind of win conditions baked into them as well. So that's, I think, really, really useful in a deck like this where you're kind of looking to outvalue everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So having some of those bodies like the Anathiomancer that can conceivably kill people is pretty solid here.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's going to wrap up looking at Dylan's deck here. Dylan, that was fun. I was not expecting... I've seen Inalla decks, and I knew it was going to do wizard stuff, but I like the twist you have where you're running a bunch of non-wizards you're making into wizards to further exploit that ETB ability, because there's so few wizards that have a great one, want to make everything into a wizard. That was a fun deck. I like it very much. Any parting thoughts from you, Max?
Yeah, I really liked this deck. I was torn, when I first started doing my notes about, I get what they're trying to do using the xenograph stuff, which is really unique. I do like this, value, big beater value creatures that are in Grixis, and then finding a way to make them wizards so you can get copies of them.
Yes.
But I'm going to kind of reiterate what I have been saying through the show. I think you just need a little more wizards in the deck proper, just so you can, cover your bases in case you don't get any of those effects out. For all you know, someone's going to run a card that rips cards out of your library, and that's what I would go for if I knew that was your game plan.
Yeah.
Granted, a Rule 0 conversation would probably stop that from happening, but you never know what can happen.
Right. Very true. Yeah. All right, that is going to wrap up this episode of Commander Central. I am Dana. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find them at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We'll be back next week with another show. Until then, I am Dana.
And I'm Max.